The afternoon sun cast a faint glow over Washington, D.C. Karoline Leavitt, 27 years old and the youngest White House press secretary in history, rested in her luxurious apartment near the White House. The small silver cross on the collar of her navy blue blazer, a mark of faith from New Hampshire, glimmered as she stood up. Her phone rang. President Trump was calling. "Karoline, there's a religious case at the D.C. local court. A group of Christians is suing because they were banned from praying in public. Go now, observe. Report." His voice was urgent. No time to think. No questions asked. She knew when the president gave an order, it meant something important. Her tidy apartment reflected her discipline. Documents were neatly stacked, business attire prepared in advance. Today she chose a simple yet professional look. Blazer, white shirt, black pants. But she still wore the cross. Always. As Trump's spokesperson, she was used to handling crises. But this was different. This was personal. She grabbed her bag, stepped into her sleek black SUV, and sped through the crowded streets. NPR blared the news, but she turned it off. Focus was everything. Inside the D.C. local court, chaos reigned. Citizens waiting for minor cases, traffic violations, contract disputes, murmured among themselves. The sound of keyboard clacking filled the room from the clerk's corner. The air felt thick, the space cluttered. She checked her watch. 2:53 p.m., just minutes before the religious case hearing would begin. The one Trump wanted her to monitor. She found a seat in the middle row, placed her document bag beside her, and opened her phone to take notes. The silver cross around her neck caught the harsh fluorescent lights, drawing unwanted attention. She didn't notice, but others did. A middle-aged man in a t-shirt reading "I am king" scrolled through his phone. To her right, a young woman in an oversized necklace, shinier than a chandelier, whispered to her lawyer. Karoline frowned. Dress code clearly wasn't an issue here. Her focus returned to the case. A Christian group was suing the government over a ban on public prayer in a local park. It was the kind of issue Trump wanted to champion, a symbol for conservatives, and she was here as his eyes. The wooden door behind the judge's bench swung open. Judge Charles Hargrove entered, his rigid demeanor commanding instant silence. At 62, his salt and pepper hair was combed back, wire-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose. His black robe was pressed flat, as if just ironed. All rise. James Wilson, the tall, imposing bailiff, gave the command. Karoline stood with the rest. Her phone still in hand, she studied Hargrove, watching his every move. He banged his gavel. This is a court of law, not a place to show off personality. Case after case moved swiftly. A man fined for parking in the wrong spot. $50. No argument. A woman late on rent. A light warning. Hargrove ran his courtroom like a machine, efficient but cold. Karoline's gaze flicked to the man in the "I am king" t-shirt as he stood for a neighbor dispute. No comments from the judge. Then the woman with the oversized necklace took the stand. Still no mention of dress code. Karoline frowned. Something was off. Hargrove's eyes landed on her. He froze mid-sentence, flipping through his papers, stalling. His gaze sharpened behind wire-rimmed glasses, as if recognizing someone familiar. "Miss Leavitt." The courtroom turned. Murmurs rose. Some recognized her. The White House press secretary. That cross, it doesn't belong here. The courtroom is a neutral place, not somewhere to display faith. Karoline lifted her chin. She scanned the room. No dress code signs. No rules against religious symbols. "I'm Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary. I'm here to observe a case for work. This is a personal item protected by the First Amendment, violating no rules." The murmurs grew louder. Hargrove squinted, his face tightening. "Work? This isn't the place to wear that and cause trouble. The courtroom is neutral, not a church." His gavel slammed against the wood. The bailiff, James Wilson, shifted beside the bench. Even he seemed uncertain. Silence. Karoline didn't flinch. She took a step forward. Your Honor, I'd like to clarify something. You made no comment about the man in the graphic t-shirt. You allowed the woman in oversized jewelry to speak uninterrupted. Hargrove's mouth twitched. And yet you single me out for a small cross necklace. A ripple ran through the room. Karoline pulled her phone from her bag, tapped the screen, and held it up. Under Tinkerver's Des Moines, personal expression, including religious symbols, is protected unless it disrupts proceedings. I am disrupting nothing. Therefore, this fine is baseless. Hargrove's fingers tightened on the gavel. The murmurs grew louder. Someone in the back whispered, "She's right." Karoline remained still. Hargrove hesitated, flipping through his notes. He cleared his throat, grasping for control. "Miss Leavitt, you seem to know your case law." A tense pause. "The fine is rescinded." A collective exhale swept through the room. A moment of quiet victory. Karoline nodded once, unfazed. She grabbed her bag, turned on her heel, and strode toward the door. As she reached the exit, her phone buzzed. A message from Trump. "Well done." Fade out. Mrs. Thompson, the middle-aged court clerk with her hair in a tight bun, stopped typing. Her eyes flicked toward Karoline, curiosity in her gaze. The man in the t-shirt and the woman with the oversized necklace whispered to each other, clearly surprised that Hargrove hadn't noticed them. Karoline stood still, gripping her phone tightly. The realization struck her immediately. Hargrove wasn't just targeting her. He was targeting the cross itself, a symbol he seemed to despise. "Sir, I have the right to wear it under the First Amendment," she said, her voice calm but firm. Hargrove cut her off. "Don't lecture me on the law. Step up to the bench, now." The crowd held its breath. Karoline took a deep breath, stepping forward. Her heels clicked lightly on the worn wooden floor of the D.C. local court. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on her. The silver cross on her navy blazer collar glimmered under the lights, a small flame amid an approaching storm. Judge Charles Hargrove sat elevated above the room, his eyes narrowing behind wire-rimmed glasses. His face grew red with anger. "So, what are you doing here with that thing, Miss Leavitt?" His voice was low, sharp as a razor, his attempt at control barely concealing his disdain. "Sir, I'm here on duty and have the right to wear it," she replied, still clutching her phone. Her thumb discreetly switched on the recording mode. Hargrove slammed his gavel against the bench, the sound cracking through the room. "I've seen plenty of people like you, thinking faith gives them the right to disrupt anywhere. This is my courtroom and I say it's not allowed." He leaned forward, gripping the gavel tightly. "Do you know this behavior is contempt of court?" Karoline furrowed her brow and glanced quickly around the room. The man in the I Am King t-shirt sat there unnoticed. The woman with the oversized necklace whispered to her lawyer, ignored. Yet her tiny cross was the problem. "Sir, I'm not disrupting anything," she said, her voice steady. "I'm here for work, and my attire doesn't affect anyone. If you have a specific ban, I'd like to see the written rule." Hargrove smirked, cold and humorless. "A rule? I am the rule here," he said. "You walked into my courtroom with that, disrespecting the law, and now you dare demand a document?" He banged the gavel again, harder this time. Mrs. Thompson stopped, typing, looking up with concern. The crowd murmured. An older man in the back row shook his head, whispering to his neighbor, "That necklace over there is bigger. Why is no one saying anything?" James Wilson, the bailiff, stood near the bench, tilting his head slightly. He had worked in this courtroom for 15 years. He recognized this moment. This wasn't the first time he had seen Hargrove's bias at play. Karoline took another deep breath. A direct argument wouldn't sway Hargrove, but she knew the long game. "Sir, if I've broken a rule, I have the right to a clear explanation," she said, subtly adjusting her phone to ensure the recording continued. Hargrove sneered, taking her words as a challenge. "Explanation? Here's your explanation. I'm fining you $500 for contempt of court." The gavel struck a third time, its sound ringing like a final verdict. The crowd gasped. Mrs. Thompson's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Her expression was uneasy. $500? A young woman whispered to her friend. Just for a cross? The man in the I Am King t-shirt let out a quiet chuckle but quickly silenced himself when Hargrove glared his way. You'll pay today before you leave, Hargrove continued, his tone dripping with condescension. Maybe this fine will teach you to respect order. This isn't a church, Miss Leavitt, nor a stage for your performance. He leaned back, smug, as if he had just won an unchallenged fight. Karoline stood still, her sharp eyes locked on Hargrove. Sir, I understand your ruling, she said, her voice even but laced with resolve. But I have the right to ask, why aren't the others in this room with printed shirts and oversized jewelry being fined too? Hargrove's face flushed. His grip on the gavel tightened until his knuckles turned white. Don't change the subject, he snapped. You're the only one bold enough to bring a religious symbol into my courtroom. That's the difference. Karoline nodded slightly. Her suspicions were confirmed. She said nothing more, but her mind was clear. Hargrove wasn't just biased. He was targeting Christian faith deliberately. Mrs. Thompson resumed typing, but her fingers trembled. In her 12 years as Hargrove's clerk, she had rarely seen him fine someone so harshly for something so trivial. James Wilson stood near the bench, arms crossed, his gaze carrying a hint of empathy. He had watched Hargrove handle hundreds of cases, but this was different. The judge's fixation on Karoline stood apart. The crowd's whispers grew louder. A few people sneaked out their phones despite the strict no filming rule. Karoline remained still, gripping her own phone tightly. Her mind raced. This wasn't just about a fine. It was a chance to expose something much bigger. Are you done, sir? She asked, her voice soft but razor-sharp. Hargrove frowned, caught off guard by her composure. Not yet, he replied. You'll pay the fine and I'll move on. Sit down. Karoline didn't move. Instead, she stepped closer to the bench, resting, her hand on its edge, her eyes locked on Hargrove's. I'll pay, she said, her voice low but brimming with determination. But we're not done here. Hargrove smirked, but for the first time his confidence wavered. Karoline stood firm at the defendant's stand, unwavering. The silver cross on her navy blazer gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights, a silent challenge. Hargrove had just fined her $500 for contempt of court. His face was still flushed red with triumph, his hand gripping the gavel. The courtroom held its breath, the murmurs fading to silence. Miss Thompson, the court clerk, stopped typing, her anxious gaze darting between Karoline and Hargrove. James. Wilson remained by the bench, arms crossed, tilting his head as if sensing something bigger about to unfold. Hargrove broke the silence. Did you hear me, Miss Leavitt? $500, payable today. Sit down. We have other business. The gavel slammed against the wood, a signal that the discussion was over. But Karoline didn't budge. She took a deep breath, placed her hand firmly on the bench's edge, and spoke. Sir, before I sit, I need to clarify a few things for the record. Hargrove's frown deepened, thrown off by her steadiness. The record? He scoffed. You've got no right to demand anything here. His voice wavered slightly. Karoline gave a small, knowing smile, not taunting but the confidence of someone in control. She reached into her document bag and pulled out a small, gleaming gold card. She held it up for the entire courtroom to see. I'm Karoline Leavitt, White House Press Secretary, serving under President Donald Trump. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The man in the I Am King t-shirt gaped. The woman with the oversized necklace whispered something frantically to her lawyer. Hargrove froze, his hand gripping the gavel stilled mid-air. That doesn't change the fact that you broke my rules, he muttered, his voice suddenly quieter. But Karoline wasn't finished. She took another step toward the podium, her voice echoing through the room. Your rules? Or your personal bias? Hargrove flinched. I'm here on the president's orders to observe a religious case, a group of Christians suing for their right to pray in public. This cross, she pointed to her collar, is my religious freedom protected by the First Amendment. You fine me for it, but do you know what the law says? Hargrove's face darkened, a flicker of uncertainty creeping in. "I don't need you teaching me the law," he snapped. "This is my courtroom, and I decide—" Karoline cut him off. "You're wrong, sir. The law isn't yours alone." She let the weight of her words sink in before continuing. "Let me remind you of Church of Lukumi Babalu I versus City of Hialeah, 1993. The Supreme Court ruled that banning religious symbols without just cause violates the Constitution. So I ask you, do you have just cause? Or is this just because you don't like it?" The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. A few people dared to lift their phones again, snapping photos despite the ban. Hargrove opened his mouth, but no words came out. Mrs. Thompson held her breath, fingers hovering over the keyboard. James Wilson nodded slightly, a rare flicker of approval in his eyes. He had seen many cases over the years, but never had a defendant flip the script this fast. Karoline pressed on, her voice as steady as a rehearsed argument. "You fined me $500 for contempt, but I have proof, right here in this room, that your ruling is based on bias, not law." She turned and pointed toward the man in the "I Am King" t-shirt. That man wears a printed slogan, clearly against any so-called dress code, yet you said nothing. She then pointed to the woman with the oversized necklace. "She's wearing flashy jewelry, yet you remained silent." Karoline faced Hargrove once more. "Only my cross, a Christian symbol, angered you. That's not law, sir, that's bias." A sharp murmur ran through the crowd. Hargrove's hands trembled on the bench, his face shifted from red to pale. You're slandering me," he stammered, his voice weak, unconvincing. Karoline didn't stop. She raised her phone. "I've recorded everything," she said. "From the moment you called me up here to now, and I've already texted the White House." Karoline stood tall, her unwavering gaze locked on Judge Hargrove. "You want to find me?" "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "But this doesn't end here." The courtroom erupted. "She's right," someone shouted. Another person clapped, only to be quickly hushed by James Wilson. Hargrove panicked, grasping for control. "Miss Leavitt, I can withdraw the fine. No need to escalate this." His gavel struck the desk weakly, his voice unsteady. Karoline shook her head. "No, sir. Withdrawing it because of who I am only proves you were wrong from the start. The issue isn't me. It's how you run this court." She stepped forward. "I demand a review of the past 6 months of court records, every fine tied to religious symbols, and I propose mandatory First Amendment training for all court staff, including you." The courtroom exploded. An older man in the back shot to his feet, clapping. "That's right," he cheered. A young woman whispered in awe. "Who is she?" "Incredible." Mrs. Thompson's fingers flew over the keyboard, her eyes gleaming as if she were recording history itself. James Wilson smiled discreetly. He had sensed she was different the moment she walked in. Now he knew. Hargrove slumped back in his chair, his face ashen. His trembling fingers clutched the gavel, but for the first time, it gave him no authority. Karoline leaned in slightly. "You think I'm just a spokesperson?" she asked, her voice low but charged with power. "I've worked with President Trump through lawsuits that shaped this country. I learned the law inside and out to defend him, and now I'm using it to defend myself and others." She set her White House ID card on the bench. "You just made a big mistake, Judge Hargrove." The judge opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He wasn't just looking at a defendant anymore. He was looking at a formidable opponent, one with a national platform. The crowd roared again, scattered applause breaking out. Mrs. Thompson typed, faster than ever, as if trying to capture the weight of the moment. James Wilson stepped closer to the bench, his eyes filled with newfound respect. And Hargrove? He just sat there, his authority crumbling in real time. Karoline didn't move, her silver cross still shining, no longer just a symbol of faith, but a flag of victory. She stepped out of the D.C. courthouse into the late afternoon sun, the silver cross on her navy blazer catching the light. The clock read 3:30 p.m. Inside, the air was still electric. She paused at the glass doors, pulling out her phone. The recording had already been sent to the White House, along with a short text to Trump's senior advisor. Hargrove, find me for the cross. Handled it. Next steps needed. This wasn't just personal anymore, this was a moment. And she knew Trump and conservatives wouldn't let it go to waste. Inside, the buzz hadn't died down. An older man in the back turned to his neighbor, his voice shaking. I've never seen anyone take down a judge that fast. A young woman clutched her boyfriend's arm, whispering, she's the White House press secretary. Mrs. Thompson, still reeling, printed the court transcript with trembling hands, realizing she had just typed out a piece of history. James Wilson, the bailiff, walked out of the courtroom, already dialing a colleague. You have to hear this, he said. A young woman just silenced Hargrove. The news spread like wildfire. Karoline hadn't even reached her car when her phone exploded with notifications. A trending hashtag popped up on X, formerly Twitter. Cross and Courtney opened the app and saw the top post from someone in the courtroom. Judge fines White House press secretary $500 for wearing a cross. She fights back with the law, leaves him speechless. We're crossing court. In 10 minutes, the comments flooded in. Who is she? Unreal. Hargrove's done. A major conservative account weighed in. Proof the system is against Christians. Thank you, Karoline Leavitt. She allowed herself a small smile. This wave was just beginning. At 4 p.m., her phone buzzed again, a notification from Trump's personal account. Karoline Leavitt, my amazing spokesperson, just taught a leftist judge a lesson on religious freedom. Legal genius. We won't let them suppress faith. They're crossing court. 50,000 retweets in under 30 minutes. Fox News was already running headlines. White House press secretary faces off with judge over cross and wins big. Then her phone rang. Trump's senior advisor. You did great, he said, his voice brimming with excitement. The president wants this amplified. Prep a statement. Meanwhile, behind the bench, Charles Hargrove sat alone in his dimly lit office. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. D.C.'s Judicial Council. His legacy, his authority, his career, all unraveling before his eyes. Cases. No one ever questioned it. Until now. Linda took the statement, nodding. This isn't just one case. It's a pattern. At that moment, a junior investigator rushed in, face pale. You need to see this. She handed Linda a fresh file. Emails leaked from Hargrove's office. Among them was a message from last year. Make sure we crack down on visible religious displays. Can't have this courtroom looking like a church or a mosque. Linda exhaled sharply. This is bigger than we thought. Meanwhile, across town, Karoline adjusted her blazer, stepping onto the White House press room stage. The cameras flashed, the room buzzing with anticipation. She spoke clearly, confidently. This isn't just about me. It's about religious freedom. Today, I'm calling for a full judicial review of Judge Hargrove's rulings, and I urge every American who has faced this kind of bias to come forward. The Constitution is clear. We will not let personal prejudice override the law. The reporters fired questions. Karoline, do you think Hargrove should resign? Is the White House taking legal action? Has President Trump spoken to you about this personally? She smiled slightly. Stay tuned. Back in his office, Judge Hargrove watched, his career slipping through his fingers. The phone calls hadn't stopped. Reporters, colleagues, and now his own legal team. His name was everywhere. By morning, the D.C. Judicial Council had called an emergency meeting. The case files, the testimonies, the leaked emails, it was undeniable. At 9:45 a.m., a formal statement was released. Judge Charles Hargrove is under investigation for potential judicial bias. Effective immediately, he is placed on administrative leave. Karoline saw the news alert pop up on her phone. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling. It wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a victory. We're already happening. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling with satisfaction. It started as a courtroom fight over a $500 fine, but it had become something much greater. A moment that forced the system to confront its own bias. At 7 p.m., President Trump held a rally in Florida. His voice boomed through the stadium speakers. Religious freedom is under attack, but thanks to brave Americans like Karoline Leavitt, we are fighting back, and we are winning." The crowd erupted in cheers. The movement had officially taken on a life of its own. Meanwhile, Charles Hargrove sat in the back of a quiet conference room attending his First Amendment training session. No cameras, no gavel, just him and a notepad. He scribbled furiously, absorbing every word. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one making the rules. He was learning them. Back at the White House, Karoline turned off her computer, glancing once more at the cross in the mirror. It wasn't just jewelry. It was proof that one voice, one moment, could change everything. Thanks to Karoline Leavitt, the rules had changed. Charles Hargrove, no longer a judge, stood at the first mandatory judicial training session. His voice was rough but genuine. "I thought I was being fair," he admitted, scanning the room full of court staff. "But I was wrong. Karoline Leavitt forced me to look at my own bias. Don't let the same mistake blind you." The room was silent. Some nodded in agreement. Mrs. Thompson, now appointed to oversee the court's new transparency program, sat in the front row, taking notes. Beside her, James Wilson, now a lead trainer for courtroom staff, added, "We're the eyes and ears in these halls. If we see injustice, we speak up." Hargrove exhaled. He knew this was only a small step toward redemption, but it was necessary. Meanwhile, in her White House office, Karoline carefully framed her $500 fine receipt behind glass. To some, it was just a piece of paper. To her, it was proof that one voice could make a difference. Trump strolled in, clapping her on the shoulder. "You're a star, Karoline. The religious freedom crowd loves you, and so do I," he boomed with a laugh. "We just won big. Keep the momentum going." She nodded, already preparing for her next speech in Virginia, where thousands were waiting to hear the woman who took on the system and won. The effects rippled beyond D.C. Governors from Texas, Florida, and Ohio ordered reviews of their own court policies. The Texas governor tweeted, "Thanks to Karoline Leavitt for reminding us what religious freedom means. Texas will follow." Group of Florida lawyers petitioned for similar training, citing the viral hashtag Cross in Court, which now represented more than just Karoline's case. It was a movement. People across the country posted photos of themselves wearing crosses, hijabs, and religious symbols with captions like, "My freedom. No one can ban it." Karoline scrolled through the posts, pride swelling in her chest. She hadn't planned to start a movement. She just refused to back down. At a rally in Virginia, 5,000 people waved banners for religious freedom. Standing before them, Karoline's voice rang out. "That day in court, I just wanted to do my job. But when a judge fined me for my faith, I couldn't stay silent. This isn't just my win, it's ours." The crowd erupted in cheers. Some chanted, "Karoline for president." She laughed, waving as cameras flashed. A now iconic image spread across social media. Karoline standing tall, cross gleaming on her blazer, eyes fierce with determination. The press called it the symbol of resilience. Meanwhile, back in D.C., Mrs. Thompson implemented new record-keeping rules. Every fine would now be documented and reviewed for bias. James Wilson trained young bailiffs, repeating the words that had sparked it all. Karoline spoke up. So must we. One evening, an email arrived from Linda Martinez, the investigator who had led Hargrove's case. "You didn't just change a judge. You changed the system. Thank you." Karoline set her phone down, glancing at the framed fine receipt. What started as one moment of defiance had reshaped laws, inspired reform, and sparked a national conversation. At 9 p.m., Trump called. "Karoline, you're my warrior. The opposition is panicking and we're winning." She chuckled. "Thank you, Mr. President, I'm ready." Later that night, she stepped onto the White House balcony, gazing at the city skyline. The cross around her neck wasn't just a keepsake anymore. It was a symbol of the fight she had started. A message popped up on her screen. The Judicial Council wanted her to lead a national reform commission. She smiled. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Why this story matters. The case of Karoline Leavitt versus Judge Hargrove reflects real tensions in modern America, where religious freedom, government overreach, and social media power collide. In 2025, debates over personal liberties are constant. Court cases about religious symbols, whether in schools, public spaces, or the workplace, are fought across the country. Karoline's defiance echoes the challenges many Americans face when institutions misuse their authority. Her response? Not just emotion but action. She didn't just argue. She recorded, cited constitutional law, and mobilized a network of supporters, from the White House to everyday citizens, and she won. The explosion of Yasser Cross in court and Trump's backing showcase how individual voices, amplified by digital platforms and strong leadership, can drive real change. Hargrove's transformation, from an enforcer of bias to a reformer, proves that people can change when confronted with truth. It's a lesson in patience, persistence, and the power of speaking up. Karoline framed her fine receipt because she understood something crucial. A single moment of courage can reshape the system tomorrow.